This podcast is part of the Blueberry Network, where listeners and podcasters come together. Find out more at blueberrywithnoease.com.
The Eat Sleep Right podcast is brought to you by generous grant from the Built on Dreams Media Network, with additional funding by the Sims Media Foundation, and from the generosity of listeners like you.
Stand by, please. Rolling on 6 now. On 6.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 49 of the Eat Sleep Right podcast, available at eatsleepright.net and downloadable in iTunes. The Eat Sleep Right podcast is also enjoyable at the Public Radio Exchange at prx.org. I'm your host, Adam Scull. Regular listeners know my purpose here is to find out how writers get to be an author, how they got where they are, how they do what they do, and how they go from a blank page to a finished manuscript. Do yourself a favor and listen to what they have to say. If you've enjoyed the Eat Sleep Right podcast or had your own success in writing, I'd like to hear from you. Tell me about yourself and your story, and I may get back to you and ask you to be a guest on the Eat Sleep Right podcast. If you have any questions or comments, anything at all, please write me. The email address is comments@eatsleepright.net. Yesterday's Friends, written by Randall Andrews, read by your host, Adam Scull. Danny and I were good friends. Check that. Danny was a good friend to me. We grew up neighbors, and by virtue of being a neighbor, I associated with him when my cooler friends wouldn't. He suffered from asthma, wore glasses so thick you could burn insects with them, and always had a runny nose under his carrot red hair. Until we were in second grade, his shoes were never tied because he didn't learn how, and he had not, in a moment of shame, begged me to teach him. I doubt he'd have ever learned. He had a bad penchant of always apologizing, even when there was no reason. More than anything else, Danny wanted friends and was willing to suffer the insults of practical jokes and endure the false hopes of promises by so many people he knew telling him he would never be invited to places they had no intention of keeping their word on. I suppose that was a sparing thing, though, because at my 12-year-old birthday party, Jimmy Ryder and Tommy Drake tackled him in our backyard football game, and when his glasses flew off, they took turns finding them with their shoes. Jimmy picked up the crushed magnifying glasses and stated, "They must have broke when they came off, Danny." They tackled him just to be mean. He didn't even have the ball. I hadn't given him the ball the entire game because I knew they wanted to hurt him. Danny sat there on the grass, stained from shoulder to shoes, telling the guys, "Sorry I ruined the game, but I can't play without my glasses." He turned to me and asked if I wanted him to run home and get his other pair. Even though Jimmy and Tommy encouraged him, I forbid him to go. "No, the game is over anyway." I looked at my 5 friends on the opposite side. "You win." Outside of Jimmy and Tommy, Greg Hester, who was on my team, could be just as mean. "Way to go, Danny. If you weren't such a moron, we could have won." I don't know what compelled my friends to treat Danny so poorly. They were good guys, great athletes all the way through school. I played on the state championship football team with Jimmy and Greg, and Tommy and I were starters on our basketball team. All 4 of us were on the baseball team together. They were popular guys, and we had a pact that we formed when we were in high school. We'd have each other's back no matter what. I dated Greg's little sister, Tammy, from my junior year until partway through college. I spent a lot of time at the Hesters, sort of my second home. Mr. and Mrs. Hester sat next to my parents at all the sporting events. By the time I hit junior high, it wasn't cool to hang with Danny, although we both took the same bus home as soon as Jimmy got off, which was about a half-dozen stops before us. Danny would scoot from the front to the back and sit next to me. Jimmy wouldn't let Danny sit anywhere past the second seat from the front. I could have stopped Jimmy. He knew I could stop him real easy if I wanted to, But I didn't want to see Danny endure the ridicule, so I welcomed Danny, not making waves about it. If anyone considered the guys cruel to Danny, they thought they were saints compared to the girls. Guys that invite you along so they can make fun of you still give you a chance to interact, regardless of how many times they use you as their monkey. The girls we grew up with never gave Danny the time of day, other than to shriek at his presence. The only girl that was pleasant to him was Tammy Hester. Part of it was she was a sweet person. The other part was she knew I had never had an unkind word about Danny, and Danny would do anything for me. Because school was a social nightmare for Danny, he didn't excel at anything, even school. I used to tell him, "Danny, you have to crack the books. Someday you might be a doctor." He'd laugh, "No, I'm never going to be anything, except your friend, that is." I did enough studying for the both of us. I was an only child, and my parents kept a watchful eye on my schooling. If I wanted to play sports, I had to keep my grades up. I did well in school. I had 1 B in junior high and 2 Bs in high school. The rest were A's. Danny once beamed with pride all the way home on the bus when he had got 1 B and the rest C's. That swelling of joy was one of the best things I saw in Danny. All our lives I saw his pain hidden behind eyes that brushed it off, and for one afternoon as school was ending for the summer, nothing could bring him down. What did bring Danny down was high school. We saw a lot less of each other because I drove to school and Danny still took the bus. I probably should have given Danny a ride, but our interests had differed, me becoming more involved in the totality of high school life, and Danny slipping into that place where kids go when they are unwanted. The make-believe world where they're the characters they watch on TV or read in books. Of course, I still saw Danny at the Christmas holidays. He always came to our house with a gift for our family. He acted embarrassed and always said his mom made him bring it over, but I learned years later the gift always came from Danny, and his parents had no feelings one way or the other. He'd stick around and eat my mom's cooking. She'd tell him what a fine young man he was growing up to be. I think he sometimes wished my mom was his. I also saw Danny every day after the state championships in football. I broke my arm making a tackle on the next to last play of the game. We won, but I wasn't around for the celebration. When I got home, there was Danny. He went to the game with my parents. He went to all the games with my parents. He never sat in the student section because there wasn't anyone who would talk to him. So he kept stats right next to my father. My dad would say, "How many yards did Steve have?" Danny would rattle off the total, or my dad would ask, "How many tackles does Steve have?" Danny always gave the right number, but argue I should have credit for more. That year I broke my arm, he came over every day and would sit around and talk about all the times we had together when we were kids. It amazed me how he remembered them as being so good when I remembered how bad they were for him. He had energy of never quitting on the idea that one day life was going to turn around for him. My parents weren't too happy I gave Danny driving lessons in my car. Since I had a broken arm, I decided to let Danny drive. However, one morning going to school, Tommy and Greg pulled up alongside us and challenged Danny to a race. Danny was so nervous that when he kicked it into first and ran it to second, he pushed it into reverse and dropped my transmission. I wanted to cuss, but Danny was so upset he nearly cried. I smiled and shook it off. I flagged down Tommy and Greg and was going to get a ride when Danny whispered, "Please don't make me ride with them." "You sure?" "Yeah, they're going to dump all over me about your car. Maybe we can tell them you're out of gas?" "Danny, that clank you heard could be heard all over town. I'm pretty sure they know what happened." His eyes welled up and he said, "You go back with them. I'm going to walk back home." When Tommy pulled up alongside, Greg asked, "You need a ride?" He looked at Danny. "Not you." "Shut up, Greg." "No, we'll walk." "Walk? You won't get to class until third period. Come on, hop in." "No, I'm fine." "Suit yourself." With that, Tommy revved his Camaro and they were off. Danny looked at me. "You seriously want me to walk?" "Danny, the bus stop's right there." I pointed to where several underclassmen from our school stood. We took the bus that morning and I discovered even the younger kids weren't nice to Danny. But since I became one of the jocks at our school, Danny had a newfound power walking on the bus with me. I was grumpy and scooted 2 freshmen out of the back seats, but Danny apologized and thanked them for moving. I hadn't taken the bus since junior high. One of the juniors on the football team took me under his wing when I was a freshman, and I rode with him until I got my license midway through my sophomore year. It felt kind of nice talking with some of the kids I didn't know, and I think it helped Danny because none of them could believe he was my friend. I think about that moment a lot because I made a decision that day to make life better for Danny, and in hindsight, I screwed things up. I should have continued to let Danny live his life as it was intended to be. After my car was fixed, I drove Danny to school. We'd swing by Tammy's and get her, and he'd jump to the back seat, just happy to be part of somebody's clique. Even though Danny would sit in silence once we got in the car, Tammy always engaged him in conversation about what he was up to. Danny was shy, and the answers were usually nothing. If she asked what he was going to do on the weekend, nothing. However, if she asked what he thought about one of the games we played, and I was in it, he wouldn't shut up, so she seldom asked. He was my driving buddy until we graduated from high school. In that time, he came into his own and was much more assertive if challenged. The old Danny would never allow himself to get put in a situation where he might get punched, but the new Danny not only put himself in that situation, but actually welcomed a punch when it came at the end of Scott Parker's fist. Danny might have been unpopular, but Scott was downright hated. Scott was held back when we were little and joined our class in the 2nd grade. He was bigger than most of us until about the 8th grade, when everyone caught up to him and a few of us surpassed him. Still, he had a love for fighting, and unless you were willing to carry it through, he was going to fight. Danny didn't know that. Danny was sure because Scott knew he was a friend of mine, he was safe. What Danny hadn't counted on was Scott was not caring if I beat the shit out of him. Scott looked at a day where he got into 2 fights as a banner day, even if one of them led to a black eye. It was right after 5th period in the fall of our senior year. Scott stood in the center of the hall as Tammy passed, never taking his eyes off her and staring at her butt as she walked away. He commented, "Why didn't you let Scott have some of that?" Danny took exception and reminded Scott who he was talking to. "You know that's Steve Longmire's girlfriend." Scott growled at Danny. "So? Who the fuck cares?" Danny should have turned and walked away, but instead decided to throw an insult. Greaser. Not that Greaser was much of a barb, but Scott didn't need a barb to start a fight. Scott walked towards Danny with purpose, and before Danny could get the words out, "What are you going to do?" Scott dropped him with a hard punch to the stomach. I had just come out and saw the tail end of the incident, the punch. I shoved Scott into a locker as he stood over Danny, prodding him to get up. Scott laughed. "What, are you going to sucker punch me?" His face was buried into the locker, and I had my face around the back of his neck. I let him go and allowed him the courtesy of turning around, but I didn't give him the chance to talk. I blighted his lip and blackened his eye. There was a commotion from the other end of the hall, and judging from the sounds of students, we knew it was old man Jefferson, our vice principal. I stood Danny up and looked over at Scott, who quickly wiped the blood away from his face. Everyone started walking away as if nothing had happened, but Jefferson took one look at Scott and stopped the crowd. Scott getting sent home wasn't a big deal to anyone, but me getting sent home would be. So when Jefferson asked what happened, no one knew a thing. I gained respect for Scott because all he had to do was fess up and I'd be in the office with him. But like the true fighter he was, when he was asked who did it to him, he said, "I ran into the locker." Jefferson grabbed him by the arm and off they went. I never got called into the office. However, one day Scott told me someday Danny wouldn't have me as his guardian angel. Danny, on the other hand, got much needed attention from a lot of kids at school. He got a lot of way to goes from the kids who cowered to Scott. That day he got punched, I asked him, "What were you thinking? Scott Parker doesn't take crap from anybody, Danny." He looked at me and I could tell his stomach still hurt. Nothing. Danny put effort into school our senior year. I could tell he wanted more than he thought he was entitled to. And why shouldn't he? Why shouldn't we all? Even though he had some more confidence, I could never get him to ask a girl out. Not that anyone would go out with him, but I really wanted to see him on a date. When our senior prom came around,